an original.
From Story Studio Network.
I want you to think about this. Canadian forestry has a role to play in saving the planet.
Absolutely. The answer is yes.
Welcome to this Story Studio Network podcast series. I'm Dave Trafford. In this series, Aaron Trafford and I will explore a number of ideas that hinge on the notion of Canadian forestry helping to save the world.
There's no path to a net zero carbon economy without the forest sector and forest products, full stop.
We'll talk about how and why Canadian forests have the ability to shift the climate crisis and the economy to build a better future.
There is no machine and no process known to man better than a tree that's sequestering carbon.
We'll explore innovations in forest management that drive a green economy and directly address the climate issue.
We have a significant amount of the world's forest land. With that privilege comes the responsibility of taking care of it.
So welcome in to this special series produced for Forestry for the Future. You know, since we started working on this project, I'm reminded of the old adage about, eating the elephant.
Yep, you eat an elephant one bite at a time.
Right, yeah.
But it's breakfast. Why are we eating elephants?
Well, I'm realizing it's a metaphor that really does fit into this battle to fight climate change. I mean, there's no single solution. If we're going to meet net zero carbon targets by 2030, 2050, it's only going to happen if we have a concerted effort on a whole bunch of fronts. And that's going to take a lot of people, a lot of policymakers, a lot of politicians out of their comfort zones.
Well, the reality is we don't have a lot of choice right now. And that's why it's that much more important to make sure we're working with these evidence-based scientific solutions. And we're seeing that as we explore this notion that the forest and wood industry has a major role to play in achieving these net zero goals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, here's a fun fact, though, about achieving net zero. I discovered this week it's all about the elephants as well.
But we're not eating the elephants, right?
No, we're not. No elephants were eaten in the making of this podcast. But this series is called Canadian Forestry Can Save the World.
Uh-huh.
But I came across an article this week that said elephants can save the world.
Really?
Yeah. So It turns out this article, I think it was from a university in the United States, it lands right in the middle of our forestry conversation.
How so?
Well, the elephants in Africa apparently have a preferred appetite to munch on trees that produce light wood. They're less dense. It means they store less carbon.
Okay, so I love elephants, but I'm like, how does this help?
All right. So the low density trees means it allows for the high density, the higher carbon storing trees to thrive. So we've talked a lot about the need to thin forests in the last few episodes. We talked about harvesting or how fire. In earlier episodes, it means making the forest more resilient when we do that. So it turns out here, the elephants are actually like foresters. I mean, their dining habit is a natural way of thinning the forest, and it makes it more resilient and a healthier carbon sink.
Okay, so this is super cool. Maybe an elephant's a new mascot. Because saving the elephants, saving the forest, saving the world.
Right. So the elephants contribute to dealing with the elephant in the room.
Okay, I love this fun fact.
So the elephant story made me think of our 21st century relationship with the forest. I mean, historically, you can rightly assert that forests and the forestry industry is really a backbone of Canada.
The forest industry is the backbone of Canada as well as Ontario.
Meet Faye Johnson.
I'm Faye Johnson. I'm a registered professional forester. Currently, I'm retired and doing some volunteer work setting up a local forest management corporation in Temagami called the Temagami Forest Management Corporation.
Living in Northern Ontario, Faye says forestry wasn't just a source of commerce. It actually created community more than a century ago.
we wouldn't be populated in the north if it wasn't for forestry. A little bit of mining, but really the first interest over 100 years ago was to get pulp and paper mills in the north. And the way that they did that was they attracted mostly US businessmen by saying, if you come and put a pulp and paper mill here, which of course is a very expensive endeavor, a lot of capital, then we will give you a huge tract of land, because in Ontario, the Crown owns the forest lands. And so that's how communities sprung up in the north. And so you will see that communities are built around mills. Mills aren't built around communities. So if you think about Kapuskasing, Fort Francis, or Iroquois Falls, Sault Ste. Marie, all of those communities started in part because of forestry. Now, I don't want to take away, the transportation and the fur trade, et cetera, that started hundreds of years before that. But the increase of immigrants or settlers to the north was because of forestry. And on the way, they found, of course, mining opportunities, which also assisted.
Forestry, mining, the fur industry, that's what attracted the Europeans when they first landed in this part of the world in the 16th century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, evidence, you know what, still exists. If you go to a mall in Halifax or Toronto or Vancouver, you are going to see evidence of it. The Hudson Bay Company, incorporated by royal charter in 1677, and was, for all intents and purposes, when you think about it, the de facto pre-Confederation government of Canada, because it held a monopoly on trade.
So there was no forestry industry per se prior to Confederation either, but it is important to note that the jurisdiction over the forest was explicitly spelled out in the British North American Act. What is that, Canadian history, grade 7, something like that when we learn about that. So,
right.
I mean, the BNA was the Canadian Constitution 1.0, right? Most of Canada's forest was owned by the federal and provincial governments, and it would be up to the provinces to administer and manage those crown lands.
Yeah, so it means in the earliest days, forests, the forestry industry was the primary source of tax revenue for a newborn country.
I think it was over 75% came from the harvesting of trees. So there was an administrative fee paid to the Ontario government for every cubic meter or stick of wood that you cut down. And that's how that's what supported. That's why the forest industry was so important back then, because it supported the politicians. Now, today, that it's almost negligent. Or very little that is actually provided, because of course the tax regimes changed, income tax came in, things like that. But way back, it was around getting the industry to build an opportunity to employ people and to pay taxes.
Well, I think it's a foundational aspect of the country.
And Laird Van Damne would agree.
My name is Laird Van Damne.
Not only does he have a name that sounds like an action figure, but he's a forester who owned a forest company in Ontario.
I've been a professional forester since 1985, and I live in Thunder Bay. I also owned a company, KBM Resources Group, but I had a long affiliation with Lakehead University, where I went to school, and I taught forest policy and remain an adjunct professor till today.
And Laird's something of an historian when it comes to his perspective of our forest industry in Canada.
And going back to the relation with Indigenous people in the fur trade, they were essential navigators and agents in this business. And then as we moved toward the Industrial Revolution, changing things to make it more important for the timber rather than the fur and agriculture, and the railways got developed, the relationship with Indigenous people changed, and we saw an acceleration of technology changes, which hasn't stopped. I mean, now our relationship with the forest has changed yet again, and it's changing quickly.
Interesting to hear in that short clip, Laird uses the words relationship and change several times
Yeah.
as he summarizes the development and growth of the country and the forest industry.
Yeah, particularly important to hear him talk about the change in our relationship with the forest over the past 100 years or so. The change seems to have accelerated even more in the last 40, 50 years.
When I started my career, we were just moving from, an industrial revolution-based relationship of wood supply to pulp mills and sawmills, and they still are important today, of course. But now we're thinking about what does this mean in the age of the Anthropocene and what it means for a carbon balance.
Wait, in the age of what?
The age of the Anthropocene.
The age of the Anthropocene. I had to look it up. I found a definition from the folks at National Geographic, aimed at grades 5 to 8, so I figured that was going to be okay for me. The Anthropocene epoch is an official unit of geologic time used to describe the most recent period in Earth's history when human activity started to have a significant impact on the planet's climate and ecosystems.
Okay, so the idea is we, you and I, humanity, is a change agent contributing to a changing climate.
What's different now with 8 billion people is the impact of humans on the global environment, is creating a new environment and new challenges never seen before.
Makes sense. And that's the heart of the climate change conversation, right? I mean, I learned something, if not how to pronounce Anthropocene, but Laird focuses on the change in relationship before the change in the climate.
The relationship between society and the forest has changed over my lifetime and is changing again. And it's changing rapidly.
So the sophistication of the complexity of forest management, I think, has shifted as well as our relationship over that period of time, no?
Yeah, complexity is a good word in that the relationships between society and nature has changed, is changing rapidly. And I was teaching forest policy for a few years, and I would challenge my students in the age of the Anthropocene, what does this mean for protected areas? What does it mean for the forests that we manage? And it's an unanswered question right now of what the best course of action is.
As Laird describes it, so calmly, I might add, the complexity of the problem, climate change, is all the more complicated by our ability not just to reassess and understand our relationship with the forest, but to get a handle on how rapidly that relationship is changing. Means we've got a very short period to identify the threat, never mind the solution.
Yeah, it is stunningly short. When I look back to as the ice retreated and forests, presented themselves on the landscape of Canada, and Indigenous people made a good living, chasing caribou, catching fish, and trading amongst themselves. That went on for thousands of years. And then the fur trade was hundreds of years. And the Industrial Revolution was 150 years. And now we're in this information technology revolution and also the age of the Anthropocene, where the rate of change is stunningly fast. And our institutions have to be as agile. And, they weren't built that way. But, human beings are remarkably resourceful people. They survived in front of the edge of the ice. They survive in this age of technology. Well, some may suggest, for better or worse. And that to me is a really interesting challenge, that the relationship between us and our forest is changing faster than even in my lifetime. In my lifetime, it changed quite quickly. And so, how do we respond? There is some good responses. My conversations with people at FPAC, Forest Products Association, is they're doing a good job of, aligning their members in this changing environment. And their members have a big impact on the relationship between society and its forests. And I think they're moving in a very progressive, positive way.
And interesting as well, Laird points to the Forest Products Association of Canada as a means of getting all parts of the industry to pull together and in the right direction towards these climate change solutions.
Yeah, I mean, like we said off the top, right? There's no singular solution. It's going to require that kind of collaboration and connection for success.
So we've learned our natural resources weren't just the backbone of the early trade and commerce in the country, but they also provided this foundational tax base that allowed Canada to stand on its own. And we know the importance of the forests that are enshrined in the Constitution. The majority are public owned. They're on Crown land, and those Crown land forests are administered and managed by the provinces and territories.
Our forests are publicly owned, so the way that we manage them is overseen by public policy and regulation. And that is, of course, always being informed by science. But really, we've always managed our forests for forest products and for the sustainability of, habitat for animals, etc.
And as Faye Johnson tells us, the forest management approach has been really local. It's been really regional. It recognizes the differences in our forests across the country. Indeed, even within some provinces, and it accounts for diverse forests and wildlife habitat.
We think about our moose populations, our caribou populations. It could be regional, but it's fairly local. The thing about climate change that I find very interesting as a forester is that this is not a local issue. This is a global issue. And just like anything that has, the people inside and the people outside, I can't help but think that those other countries that don't have the contiguous forest lands that we have, we have a major component of the boreal forest in the world, that don't have those, are looking to Canada to ensure that we will continue to have these large tracts of land to deal with climate change. So, as a forester, I can plan locally, but I don't think from a climate change perspective that when we do the analysis, it is a local analysis. It'll be over a large tract of land, perhaps even more than a province, and certainly it will be of global interest.
Therein lies the challenge. Manage locally to solve a global problem. That really does put the spotlight on this changing relationship with the whole forest, not just our forest.
Yeah. Globally thinking about the forest as opposed to just here in Canada also highlights the change in where the burden or even the opportunity lies in that shifting relationship with the forest. We know Canadian forestry is distinguished from other jurisdictions by virtue of the amount of forest that's publicly owned. Crown land means, as we've said before, a higher level of accountability when it comes to managing the forest than historically. That management has been viewed as a government function that involves private sector. But I asked Laird if we should be refocusing that lens and look more at the private sector's role.
There's tremendous power and leadership inside the private sector, and they're going to start doing stuff anyway. But in Canada, in particular, given the amount of public lands we have, it really requires a partnership with government.
He says the private sector is prepared to invest in forestry and its carbon capture capabilities.
There's money now showing up, in these carbon markets. The political will is starting to be there. The skills of foresters, engineers, agricultural specialists, they're out there. But in my head, the clock is ticking, and it requires serious attention.
Interesting that you talk about the investment opportunity for those who are trying to buy, those carbon credits, and that has sort of a negative tone to it. It sounds like somebody's just trying to do the least they can do to kind of get by and check.
That's called greenwashing. Right?
Exactly, check a box, right? But is there a thought or an initiative out there that I'm unaware of that says that's great because that investment actually is going to go into further accelerating the management plans that we need to achieve for the kind of outcomes that you're talking about vis-a-vis climate change?
Yeah, I think the fact that there's willing investors out there suggests to me with the right kind of regulation, it can be channeled into truly responsive and productive outcomes. Right now, it's unregulated, and currently the idea is, well, if you don't cut it down and store it, it's all good. And that's true in many circumstances, but not all circumstances. And I think this investor interest in dealing with carbon is a good thing, and it'll mature, and it has to mature quickly.
So, do we need to poke somebody at a policy level then to say we need to not rebuild, but maybe tweak or even break to some degree the model that we're already using? Because if we have that level of interest in terms of investment, there's money that's there. It sounds to me what's preventing that from actually gaining any attraction in Canada is because we're talking about crown property, government owned, publicly owned forest. So then it comes down to government policy and regulation and all the good things that we think are important around guardrails to protect the forest and make them resilient, et cetera. Is there a portion of that that needs to be adjusted so that we can take advantage of some of that investment?
Yeah, I agree. There's something needs to be adjusted. We should poke someone. I mean, I think tacitly, provincial and federal governments are on board with this sort of stuff, but they have to be more proactive, I think. And they're not used to doing that sort of thing, but they'll have to be.
Does the amount of crown land, forest land, get in the way of us being able to evolve adequately or quickly enough?
Yeah. Well, I see that as an opportunity, but it also is a challenge. It is huge, and we can't overnight, become like Finland and Sweden. And but there are things we could strategically do and experiment to make sure they're better. For example, I had a job in 2017 with investors in Arizona wanting to restart sawmills that had been shut down because they were conserving national forests for spotted owl habitat, which likes old growth. And then the fires came and they were just unmanageable. And so then the federal government that oversees these lands realized that was no longer tenable. Even the environmentalists said, well, we're not going to have any habitat left at this rate of burn. So they wanted to start thinning aggressively these forests and thin them in a way that, was like natural patterns from indigenous frequent burning for wildlife management. And I was there looking for investors to restart an industry that had stopped because of the conservation mandate in these national forests. Well, getting people back and getting these things running is much more difficult than we appreciate, but they have done it. It's working, and the government gave free stumpage. The government participated actively to make this happen. And when they have fires enter treated stands, they can control them better. So they're finding that these public policy measures are making a difference in Arizona. And California is now, of course, thinking about aggressively pursuing these things. And I would suggest a lot of boreal Canada, might consider these kinds of actions too.
If I'm hearing Laird correctly, we're not just changing the relationship with the forest, but we're changing also the way we value the forest. Yep. And that's certainly evolved since the days of Sir John A. Macdonald. In the late 19th, early 20th century, the timber industry was almost exclusively about lumber to build homes, to build bridges, to build ships. Even the earliest cars and aircraft, when you think about it, were built on wooden frames, right? The value of the wood was its durability, its relative ease to work with, its shape. But now the added value is this carbon capture capability. And as Laird says, companies are prepared to invest into that carbon sink. There's an ROI there that changes this entire conversation.
Mm-hmm. And as Faye says, it's all the more reason why the private sector voices in the industry are really important when it comes to renewing, reimagining any changes in our approach to forest management.
When the government changes their policy to deal with climate change, it will be the forest industry that has to implement that changing policy. And so they, of course, are very much involved because they're interested in it. And putting carbon, the whole carbon issue inside of that, our toolbox, it sort of changes the conversation.
It changes our perception of the value of the forest, though, doesn't it?
It does, because with carbon and getting to carbon pricing, and of course, right now we don't know, there are companies that are working towards carbon pricing, but there's a lot of things that we don't know, so it's ever evolving. That will change the perspective of what we do with our forests.
It's a huge biophysical solar panel, if we think of it that way. And how do we manage it better is very different than what we've been thinking of over the course of my lifetime, where it was important to conserve biodiversity. The things had gone perhaps a little too focused on the industrial development through the Industrial Revolution phase of our society's development. But thinking about the forest differently and our relationship with it, it will require, public policy changes. The fact there's money rolling around now means that managing the forest in a different way probably has the means to do it. And it's going to take, agreements among people in the marketplace, the carbon markets, the forest products markets, the other kinds of land use markets, including agriculture. They need to be constantly revisited and experimented with to come up with something that's going to be truly useful.
I love that. It's a huge biophysical solar panel.
Love it, yeah.
Now that's changed the way of looking at the forest completely, right? Helps us sharpen the science around our forest management. Helps us articulate this all-important ROI for companies, for consumers, governments, wanting to put hard-earned dollars into this effort to fight climate change.
Now remember, Laird and Faye both talk about the change that's needed, but let's not forget to focus on our relationship side of this equation. No matter what, we humans will always have a special, if not spiritual, response and a relationship when it comes to the wilderness of the woods.
Who doesn't feel good when they touch a wood product? Or doesn't feel good when they build with wood? You think about yourself building with wood versus cement. I mean, there's almost an emotional connection to wood, I think, for a whole host of reasons. One of them is probably because when we see wood, even though it's been processed, we think back to the forest, and forests give us a good feeling. Forests are generally spiritual places that people love to spend time in. Forest bathing is a key phrase people use now when they go to the forest. To me, it's just going for a walk in the forest, but there's an emotion associated to it, and that's what people are trying to capture.
Now, Faye and I also extended that idea into our connection with books, with musical instruments, all wood products that have that power and potential to ignite our creativity. They expand our thinking. Not quite sure you can put a price on that, but it's maybe because it's invaluable.
You're just trying to justify the 20 guitars you have in your studio. Next thing, you're going to tell me that the guitar acquisition addiction is saving the planet with all the stored carbon hanging up on the walls in your studio as instruments.
That's not a bad idea. I love the change in perspective. I mean, saving the elephants and buying guitars save the planet. There we go.
In the next episode of Canadian Forestry Can Save the Planet.
Wait, Canadian guitars can save the planet. I need a Jean Larrivée.
Okay, stop. I'm going to tell Mom. She won't let you buy another guitar. Actually, in the next episode of our series, we are going to explore a really important element of this story, the Indigenous and First Nations relationship with the forest and how that should inform this changing perspective.
Well, I think it is informing it. I found some fascinating stuff when I dug into the story. So for Aaron and our producer, Becky Coles, and the rest of the team at SSN, thanks for including us in your audio on demand routine.
Yes, and if you've got a thought about this show, a question, a comment, be sure to post it wherever you listen to the podcast. And if you listen on Apple, of course, leave us a rating.
Thinking a 5-star effort today. We were pretty good.
That was right up until you went off on guitars saving the world tangents.
All right.
Thanks for listening.
This podcast series is produced for Forestry for the Future. And for more information, I'd encourage you to visit the website forestryforthefuture.ca. And you may want to get involved in supporting a sector that's committed to growing a greener economy and driving our country towards a net zero carbon future for you and your kids. I'm Dave Trafford, and Canadian Forestry Can Save the World is produced by Story Studio Network.
This
is SSN.